Welcome everyone to our first Fridays at 4 for the academic year. I'm Debelina Roy. I'm the Senior Associate Dean of Faculty for Emory College, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here today. This collaboration between Emory College and JWJI grew out of numerous conversations in the summer of 2020 as this country and our community reeled and protested following the murder of George Floyd, and has attempted to grapple with our history of racism. One of the many things that makes Emory such an important institution and such a special place in which to work and learn is that our faculty includes some of the nation's leading scholars, artists, and voices on race and social justice. This work has never been more urgent. In the past several years, we have recruited many new faculty, including some who have only just begun to plant their feet on our beautiful campus and are not yet known beyond their own departments. So this series, Emory Scholars on Race, has been envisioned as a new monthly ritual to stretch our minds and enrich the fabric of our community by featuring the scholarship and creative works of our own faculty. And in our post-pandemic future, and there will be one, we look forward to gathering in person with all of you. I'm pleased to turn the floor over to my colleague, Professor Andra Gillespie, Director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute, who will introduce our speaker this afternoon. After today's talk, I'll be happy to moderate what I hope will be a lively Q&A, so please feel free to use the chat function on your screens, and I'll be happy to share your questions with our speaker. Andra.
Thank you, Dean Roy. It's my pleasure to welcome Sergio Delgado Moya to the First Fridays at 4 series. Professor Delgado Moya is Associate Professor of Spanish and Portuguese at Emory. He's a scholar of Latin American studies and a queer first-generation college graduate. Born in Tijuana, Mexico, and raised in Baja California and California, Delgado Moya's research is grounded in the Latin American region. All of his major research projects are transnational in scope, and they emphasize the social and political dynamics of art beyond the sphere of the aesthetic. His research has been supported by the Paul and Daisy Soros Fellowship and the Andy Warhol Foundation, among other funding sources. So I'm really excited to hear him talk about the art and the politics of disgust today. So in addition to this, he's also the author of Delirious Consumption, Aesthetics and Consumer Capitalism in Mexico and Brazil. And his new book that's coming out soon is called A Nervous Archive, Sensationalism and the Potency of Horror. So I think that's going to be a part of his talk today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our colleague, Dr. Sergio Delgado Moya.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. And thank you for being here on this Friday. I'm really pleased to be participating in this series. It's a wonderful way to reconnect with our community and get to know more about the kind of work we're doing in the university, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank Dean Roy, Professor Andra Gillespie, and Rhonda Patrick for making this event today happen. And if you're listening and you're there, I also want to thank my students, my undergraduate students, and particularly my current cohort of graduate students who have been helping me think through some of the things which I will present today. So I'll start now. And let me share a screen. I have a slideshow. So for all of the presentation, I'm going to be sharing my screen. So much of the work I've done and the bulk of the work I'm now doing revolves around questions of how meaning gets communicated in mass media, in newspapers and magazines, in television and radio, in the content produced for these platforms, and also in the advertisements that sustain these same platforms. For the last several years, and as part of a book-length project that I've titled A Nervous Archive, I've focused my attention on a distinctive type of print medium, crime tabloids, which were very popular throughout the Americas in the second half of the 20th century. The remarks I'd like to share with you today emerge from this project and revolve around one such crime tabloid titled Alarma, Únicamente la verdad. This tabloid was published in Mexico from the 1960s and well into the 21st century. During the decades when it was produced, this tabloid was tremendously popular. It left an indelible mark in the generations who constituted its readership and witnessed its popularity. It also made a notable impression on the arts and culture of Greater Mexico, providing references and materials for many artists, writers, musicians, filmmakers, and at least one opera composer. Now, one distinctive fact about this tabloid and of many other popular print publications produced in Mexico in the second half of the 20th century is that it circulated not just in Mexico, but in cities like Los Angeles, where Spanish-speaking Mexican and Mexican-American readers followed the stories in the tabloid with interest. Among these LA-based readers of Alarma, a group stands out, a collective, 4 young people who mobilized as high school students in the 1970s in Los Angeles to protest the treatment of Chicanos and Chicanas in the hands of the LAPD, and who later joined forces as the 4 founding members of the art collective known as ASCO. Now, there's a few steps in the presentation I prepared for you today that will hopefully help me clarify what I mean by the title of my talk, the Transduction of Affect, and how I see this concept actualized in the work of the art collective known as ASCO. I want to begin with a few remarks on what scholars before me have characterized as the transmission of affect, and how my own suggested term, transduction, adds to the work that has already been done. I then would like to draw an overview of the collective known as ASCO, and of the kind of works they produce as Chicano children of Chicanos, Chicanas, and Mexican-American immigrants living in the Los Angeles area in the 1970s and 1980s. I'll end my presentation with a brief overview of what a progressive appropriation of disgust might look like, and how this kind of appropriation is modeled for us in the works of the collective known as ASCO. A point I want to make has to do with what might be the need for strong negative feelings, feelings like revulsion and disgust, feelings that I'd like to present to you as necessary for both the undoing of worlds of violence and oppression, those worlds we now live in, and also as necessary for the construction of the life-affirming, love-nurturing worlds we want to live in. Now, what is the transmission of affect? The plain meaning of a few expressions in everyday language can help us stay attuned to the ways in which affect travels from one person to another. Infectious laughter, contagious energy, contagious crying. These are the kind of turns of expression which remind us that affect indeed does travel. Feminist scholars writing on psychoanalysis, on emotions, and on the crossroads of the psychoanalytic clinic, politics, and aesthetics have already set down the basic conceptual frameworks necessary for the study of affect and emotion as transmissible intersubjective forces, as things that happen between and across subjects, as energetic events that are not limited to, that do not begin or end in any one individual, in any one person. Another way of saying this is that these scholars, Jessica Benjamin, Teresa Brennan, Sarah Ahmed, and Sueli Holnicki, among others, all depart from the Freudian premise of the individual psyche as the starting point, the origin of the drive and affects. I subscribe to this view and invite you to keep it in mind as I move forward with my presentation. But how can someone feel someone else's feelings? More precisely, how can someone feel someone else's affects? This is the question that Teresa Brennan poses at the beginning of her book. Brennan starts not by wondering, but by assuming that we are capable of sensing affects that do not originate in us, that don't belong to us. In words that echo Gloria Anzaldúa, Brennan asks, is there anyone who has not, at least once, walked into a room and felt the atmosphere. Grief, anxiety, nervousness, anger. These are the kinds of things we can feel, the kinds of things some of us often feel when we walk into a room full of others, a room full of strangers. These are the type of affects that can be transmitted and whose transmission Brennan sets out to understand. Her purpose is specific, ambitious. What Brennan wants to argue is that the transmission of affect, though social and psychological, is also responsible for physical, biochemical, and neurological changes in all the sentient beings implicated in a chain of transmission of affect. What Brennan wants to claim, in short, is that the transmission of affect is an objective event as much as it is a subjective one. Put another way, the effects of this transmission of something generally thought to be psychological, touchy-feely, are physical, measurable, objectively real. The stakes of recognizing this transmission in these terms are significant, even radical. A world where affect is transmitted as a social and psychological and also as a physical event is a world where emotions and energies are not held within autonomous subjects, within self-contained individuals. What is the transduction of affect, though? I want to build on the theory of the transmission of affect by focusing on an implication of this theory that has already been explored by the scholars I listed before, an implication that can perhaps be elaborated further as we seek to understand the place of affect in the workings of our world. The implication I want to explore is that when affect transmits, it does not simply travel from form to form, from body to body, from person to person, without leaving those beings implicated in this chain of transmission in the same state they were before being involved in affect transmission. The implication I want to explore is the idea that affect does not simply transmit, it transforms, or to use a related and I hope more helpful term, it transduces. What is transduction? It's helpful to begin, I find it often helpful to begin with a brief overview of what transduction means and how it is used. In English, the simplest and oldest meanings of this word refer to the act of leading something or bringing it across from one place to another. More recently, though, transduction has acquired specialized meanings in genetics and physiology. The way the term is used in these fields can enrich our own sense of it to describe the transference of affect across different subjects and objects, and for the purposes of my talk today, across different racialized subjects and the structures of authority and domination that subject those communities to racialization. In the field of genetics, transduction refers to the process of transference of genetic material that takes place between two separate bacteria and that is facilitated by a virus. In this process, a virus using a bacterium as its host can remove part of that bacterium's DNA and later insert that portion of DNA into a different bacterium's genetic code. The process effectively introduces genetic code from one organism into the genetic code of a different organism without the need for any direct contact between the two organisms involved. And the process here, one way to imagine it is an almost magical, so to speak, transmission or an almost magical transference of genetic material between two beings who need not be in touch with each other in order for that transference of genetic material to take place between them. What I mean to say when I use the term the transduction of affect is modeled after the meaning of transduction as used in physiology, but especially in genetics. With this term, the transduction of affect, I want to signal the fact that affect not only travels from being to being, from person to person, but that it also has the capacity to change, to transform everyone implicated in this chain of transmission. What I want to keep us attuned to is that when something like sadness, when something like joy, when something like disgust travels from one being to another, from person to person, there is a chance that those implicated in this transmission of affect will be changed in their composition, in their very essence, in their DNA, so to speak. What is more, And in line with the meaning of transduction as used in the field of genetics, this process of transmission and consequent transformation can take place without the need for contact between those involved, between those transformed by the transmission of affect. And whereas in genetics, something like a virus is what makes possible the transduction of genes and subsequent genetic modification between bacteria, when it comes to affect, the transduction of affect between two separate beings can be said to take place by means of physiological signals, pheromones, for instance, as Teresa Brennan explores, or by more symbolic means, images, for instance, viral images, for instance, verbal images, visual images, performance images, viral images, images that elicit an affective reaction, images that sometimes transduce, sometimes transform, are what the ASCO collective produces in their attempt to transmit negative affect, in their attempt to transduce disgust. Who is ASCO? The names of the founding members of this collective, Gronk, Patsy Valdez, Willie Herron, and Harry Gamboa Jr., are key references in the history of Chicano culture and Chicano art history in particular. A major exhibit of their work at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art highlighted the importance of the group's work for the understanding of California and US art as a whole. Their collective work was completed under the name of ASCO, the Spanish term for nausea, revolt, disgust. This act of self-naming using the word disgust is, of course, a loaded one, especially when performed by a group of young Chicano artists. The name they chose points to the repulsion their first performances caused among the few people, mostly Mexican Americans in Los Angeles, who witnessed these first works. The name also signals the rejection these young artists experienced as Chicanos and Chicanas by a Hollywood film industry that excluded them, much as it excludes us now, from motion pictures and from all the visibility, all the desirability that inclusions in these pictures bring. The shaming and dehumanization these artists felt in the flesh as young brown people subjected to police violence and other forms of racism is also signaled by their chosen name. This choice of name and the spirit this name brought to the works produced by ASCO turned out to be a powerful gesture. Because of its invasiveness and the strength of the action it drives, disgust is singularly cutting. And the works ASCO produced as they channeled this negative affect turned out to be just as incisive. Disgust contaminates, and it moves because it contaminates. It is not just that the object of disgust, the thing, the person, or event that gives rise to disgust, comes across as potentially contaminating. By the time we feel disgust, it's already too late. We've already been sickened by the object of disgust, by its sight, by its smell, by its texture, and so contaminated by it. The profound aversion that comes from disgust rests on this act of intrusion, of loathsome intimacy, this feeling that whatever is causing disgust is not just, no longer just, outside of us. It is already somehow in us, up our nose, in our stomach. Now, for the purposes of my talk today, I want to highlight two ways in which this art collective ASCO works with disgust. The first one has to do with their dialogues with the crime tabloids I've been studying and writing about for the book I'm currently working on. And the second way with which this ASCO collective works with disgust, the second way I'd like to explore with you today, has to do with their critique, the critique of news and the film industry and the film media that they put forward through some of their works. Now, I'll start by saying something about the dialogue that the collective had with these crime tabloids. And I'll begin by saying a few things about these crime tabloids. So again, as I mentioned towards the beginning of my presentation, crime tabloids and photo novels derived from crime tabloids, like the one you have on your screen now on the left side of the screen, were tremendously popular throughout the Americas in the second half of of the 20th century. They were widely read. Their circulation ran, in the case of Alarma in particular, their circulation ran in numbers that ranged from 500,000 to 2 million issues per week in Mexico. And in a country like Mexico, 500,000 to 2 million issues produced a week indicated a tremendous readership, making crime tabloids like these the most popular forms of news in the places where they were published. Now, despite this popularity, or perhaps most likely because of this popularity, crime tabloids and the photo novels produced after crime tabloids, like the one you have on screen, are generally considered from the perspective of educated readers to be the least trustworthy and the most despicable form of journalism. Now, sensationalism was popular in the second half of the 20th century. It remains popular nowadays in places like Mexico, where newspapers characterized as sensationalist still continue to dominate the print media for news journalism. I think something like the number of sensationalist newspapers and the number of issues they manage to circulate every week is 40% greater than all national newspapers combined. These newspapers, they remain popular, and it's also worth remembering that the emergence of these forms of journalism in the case of Latin America in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s coincides with the emergence of mass communities of readers. Another way of saying this is the moments or the sort of decades when these kinds of publications, crime tabloids, what we call sensationalist journalism, the decades when these publications start to become more and more popular coincides with the decades when literacy campaigns are at their strongest in the places where these kinds of publications are being published. So the relationship there between, on the one hand, the emergence of something like a mass community of readers on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the publication of these tabloids is something that I'm interested in and that I try to stay attuned to. Now, a couple of things about the perception of these kinds of publications. Crime tabloids in general, when discussed in academic settings and when discussed by educated readers, these kinds of tabloids and related publications are usually described with one term, sensationalist, which is a term that circulates a lot in writing about these publications. Now, there's a few social scientists who have done extensive work with these publications in Latin America, and one of the findings by Guillermo Zunkel, a sociologist who's working with crime tabloids in Chile, is one of his findings is that this term, which is usually used in a dismissive sense, this term in oral histories and ethnographies of readers of sensationalist journalism that he conducted, he found that the term sensationalism and sensationalist is not used by the readers of these newspapers, this form of journalism. It's used exclusively by those educated readers who are either aware or interested in these publications, but who don't constitute part of the actual readership of the newspapers. Another one of Guillermo Zunkel's findings regarding the readership of these forms of journalism, of these crime tabloids and what we call sensationalist newspapers, is that these crime tabloids are generally perceived by their readership as being truthful and being factual, and the kind of basis or criteria that the readership puts forward as the criteria they use to assess these newspapers as truthful and factual is quite substantive. Some of the readers interviewed by Guillermo Zunkel speak of something like a moral truth behind these newspapers. And they also speak about a certain style, a blunt style of presenting information that comes across as truthful and factual for the readers of these newspapers. A couple more things about these newspapers and their readership. Another researcher who's been an anthropologist, who's done extensive work with these kinds of crime tabloids, in the Mexican context in particular, Eduardo Nibon Bolan, he offered an anecdote that I think can help us understand the reasons why ASCO's appropriation of these crime tabloids can come across as so forceful. He offered an anecdote where a case of the death of a young man in Mexico City who I think somewhere towards the beginning of our century, the 21st century, a young man who was a drug misuser and who died of a drug overdose in Mexico City. Now, this young man, he grew up in an upper middle class family, and he lived in a homeless situation for the last few years of his life, coming in and out of his upper class home, and sort of developing a series of relationships and friendships with other people who also lived on the street. Now, upon his death, a funeral was organized by his family. And at this funeral, two groups of people were present, according to Nibon Bolan. On the one hand, the family members were there to mourn their young loved one, were assembled sort of on one half of the funeral room. On the other half of the funeral room, a group began to assemble, which was constituted by the friends that this young man had made while he was living in the streets, while he was homeless. During the funeral, one of the young people who assembled on the side of the room where this young man's friends assembled started circulating an issue of one of these crime tabloids. And the issue reported the death of that same young man that everyone was mourning. Something interesting happened, and Nibon Bolan sort of directs her attention to it. The moment the crime tabloid enters the space of the funeral, the room divides clearly into two camps, if you'd like. On the one hand, the family of this young man was scandalized that a crime tabloid had portrayed the death of their young one. And they were uncomfortable in calling for the removal of that crime tabloid. On the other side of the room, those who had become friends of this young man in the street derived a great deal of joy at seeing their friend recognized in a way by this crime tabloid. And I present this to you as a sort of, as an anecdote, an illustrative anecdote of how these crime tabloids are perceived and the differences in their perception and their judgment based on the position of the person evaluating these kinds of crime tabloids. Now, ASCO, from the very beginning of the work that they completed in the 1970s, they explicitly name these kinds of publications, and this one in particular, Casos de Alarma, as a direct reference, as an influence, as a model for the kind of work that they wanted to do. And I think there's a couple of gestures that can be read, a couple of operations that are performed when a group of young Chicano artists decides to not just reference, but appropriate, to model their work based on these kinds of crime tabloids. One of these gestures that I think is performed, one of these operations that I think is performed by the collective when they begin to enter into a dialogue with these crime tabloids, and then when they begin to appropriate and reframe these crime tabloids and the kind of scopic regime that these crime tabloids work under, is to kind of perform a kind of explicit reconnection with the communities of readers, the popular readers that these publications convoke. The ways in which ASCO reframes and redirects the graphic violence and the loathsome content these publications are known for is another gesture, another kind of operation that ASCO performs when they appropriate these crime tabloids. The way in which they reframe the violence characteristic of these publications includes a good dose of humor, and you sort of see it in this picture. This is in case you're sort of trying to figure out what's going on in this picture. This is not a picture of a deaf man. This is one of the members of the collective who's still alive, and what appears to be blood is spaghetti sauce. And you see here kind of the reframing of the violence that they do in most of their works has a good dose of humor, And it also is informed in large part by both the sort of theatricality with which loathsome violence is represented in crime tabloids, and by the loathsome fascination that this theatricality manages to sustain. So much for that first use of disgust, that first sort of way of working with disgust that the ASCO collective presents to us. Now I want to move forward to what I think is a second way of working with disgust, or a second way of sort of redeploying negative affect that ASCO presents to us. And this has to do with the series of critique of news of the film industry and the film media that the collective. I found this on the web, a series of critique that the collective puts forward. So what you have in front of you is a work by ASCO called Decoy Gang War Victim from 1974. And for this work, Gronk, one of the collective's founding members, was photographed laying on the ground on a dark Los Angeles street as if he were dead. Photographs of him on the ground were sent to local media outlets. One local TV station in particular in Los Angeles in 1974 picked up the images of the staged gang violence and presented the same images in their coverage as if they were true, as yet another instance, yet another piece of evidence, as they called it, of what they described, what this TV station described at the time, using these fake images or these staged images as the violence inherent in Chicano communities in 1970s Los Angeles. Now, here is where I think the intervention, the kind of operation that ASCO is performing comes in. What I think is happening here, among other things, is a kind of redirection of shame. Shame is redirected here. The shame of living in, the shame of being from, the shame of being a part of a community that is said to be, by these media, plagued by violence, is turned around, so to speak, and redirected towards the source of that shaming, towards the subject doing that shaming. In this case, a local TV station, and by extension, the media and the powers that wield that media. This TV station, the media environment to which it belongs, and the authority that wields the power of this media environment, all of that is what is shamed in this work for their deceitful portrayal of a community and for the violent racializing effects that this misleading portrayal entails. I think what is important about this kind of work and the operation that this work performed is the ways in which it invites us to trace the effects of this action reverse, this reversal of shame in this case. When migrants, when diasporic communities, when women and queers are rendered either shameful or disgusting, when they're rendered under any one of those negative affects, an act is already performed upon them, and action is already taken against them, so to speak. And what we see here is, I think, a reversal of that action. Disgust on its own is action. Sara Ahmed writes, disgust, and I'm quoting Ahmed, it is in the intensity of bodily responses to worlds that we make judgments about worlds. And those judgments are directive, even if they do not follow narrative rules of sequence or cause and effect. Those judgments are enacted. They do not lead to actions, they are actions. And that's from one of the afterwords to the second edition of her book, Political Emotion, The Politics of Emotion. Now, the consequences that follow from characterizing someone or something as shameful, as disgusting, as unbelonging, further exclusion, for instance, or marginalization, or in the worst case, elimination, murder, are mere reactions that follow from this initial act, from the initial act of disgust. What the work of the members of ASCO teaches us in the face of this question is cutting, polemical, intractable from a liberal perspective. What ASCO is trying to teach us, I believe, what it dares us to consider, is that it will never be enough to build tolerance, to channel desire, to nurture love towards bodies that are considered threats. What ASCO teaches us is that if this kind of senseless violence is ever to be meaningfully confronted, things will have to get messy. What it teaches us is that it won't be enough to portray racialized subjects positively, that it will never be enough to make Black and brown bodies and Indigenous bodies appear as acceptable, desirable, aesthetic, right. What is also necessary, as the works of ASCO suggest to us, as the very name of the collective suggests, is to make some things, racism for instance, feel wrong, to make these things feel repulsive, disgusting. What ASCO teaches us is that the negative affect and disgust in particular need to be kept in play, except inverted, redirected against the structures, against the institutions, and against the acts that make racism, xenophobia, violence possible to begin with. The palatable principles and the prudish sensibilities of a classist and ethnocentric liberalism will have to be set aside to make room for feelings that are much more volatile, but also much more powerful. Feelings of revulsion, loathing feelings, feelings of disgust in the face of the structures and the institutions, the acts and the figures that insist on rendering other bodies, other things, and whole other peoples dangerous, repulsive, disgusting, on the basis of nothing other than differences in gender, ethnicity, race, sexuality, ability, and so forth. Now, a coda, and I'll finish with this. What is disgust? Disgust, as scholars before me have pointed out, is not some kind of instinct completely removed from reason. It is a thought-laden, evaluative force, one defined by social hierarchies and useful in reinforcing these same social hierarchies. Disgust is also, as Dan Kahan writes, a paradigmatically illiberal sentiment. When disgust enters public and political discourse as a force that shapes the principles and regulations that organize a society, it tends to do so in conservative or in the service of conservative reactionary purposes. In modern times, for instance, homosexuality has been denounced as an aversive, disgusting form of sexuality, with disgust then providing moral and legal justification for the criminalization of homosexual acts. Disgust has also been used to characterize immigrant communities, our dress in foods, our use of public and private spaces, our forms of building family relationships. It has been used and continues to be used to rally support in favor of the further marginalization and the removal of immigrant communities. Take as an example the following exchange between two conservative reactionary figures discussing Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and the fact that the district that she serves houses a large number of immigrants. And I'll read the exchange, unpleasant, disgusting as it is. I read, well, part of the reason is because her district is actually one of the least American districts in the country. And by that, I don't mean that it's not part of America, but it's occupied by relatively few American citizens. A very high percentage of her district is, in fact, illegal aliens. Now, the way they inhabit housing there is such that they live in a lot of illegal spaces, like basements. And many people live there, so they wind up producing a lot of garbage that the landlords don't want thrown out normally. Hence, you wind up with a lot of garbage on the streets. You have illegal food vendors pouring their pig grease into the gutters. I worked out there. It can be a little gross. Now, what if the same affect, the same disgust spewed by these reactionary men were to be used against them? What is the force and the implications of this reversal? Dan Kahan considers the possibility of a progressive appropriation of disgust in an essay of the same name. An essay published in a volume that brings together essays that share a common interest in the place of passions and the function of the law. An old idea gets a fresh treatment in Kahan's essay and in the other essays of the book, a 17th century idea. The idea that judgments of something are a function of how we are affected by that thing. Kahan proposes, citing William Miller's definition of disgust, that disgust is both morally indispensable, because it helps us mark, like no other sentiment, but is socially abominable, and that disgust is constant across different times and different societies, to the extent that all societies seem to rely on disgust to mold their judgment of what is acceptable and unacceptable, and what is highly regarded and viscerally disregarded. Grounded on these two theses, Kahan goes a step further to argue for the use of disgust as a guiding force in the formulation of progressive principles, in the fight against homophobia, for instance. Or we may add in the struggle against racism and xenophobia. And Kahan writes the following, I quote Kahan, "We won't be making any genuine progress in extirpating disgust. Indeed, by disclaiming disgust," this is Kahan writing, "we'll only be denying ourselves a resource to fight those who, with no embarrassment, are willing to use it to advance illiberal causes." End of quote. To whose sensibility, Kahan asked, to whose sensibility should the law defer? The heterosexual soldiers who are disgusted by the idea of sharing barracks with gays or opponents of the gays with gays, or the gay soldier band who are disgusted by homophobia? I want to conclude by revisiting the question posed by Kahan as filtered through the prism of the works of ASCO. ASCO works, as I understand their work, ASCO works by teaching us that the same feelings of shame and disgust that burden racialized subjects can be turned around and directed towards the structures and the subjects doing the work of racism. And so with that in mind, I wonder, in the case of immigration and asylum crises like the ones we confront today, to whose sensibility should the law defer? The conservative sensibilities echoed and molded by conservative media talking heads, or refugee and immigrant advocate sensibilities disgusted by the racism and xenophobia undergirding conservative perspectives on migration? Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. That was incredible. We have some questions that are starting to come through. I encourage you all to, submit your questions through the Q&A. The first one comes, Sergio, from Edgar Randolph. And the question is, through transduction, do crime tabloids play a role in identity formation in Chicano communities that they do not in Mexican communities? What is the relationship between class and transduction, and what is educated?
I think, unfortunately, that's a great question. Or the first part of the question is a great question regarding the kind of differences that we can and should note in terms of how these kinds of crime tabloids circulate in our, not just read, but mediated by different communities depending on their location. In this case, by communities based in Mexico, which is where the publication is produced, and then communities on the other side of the border, Los Angeles, for instance, where these same crime tabloids also circulate. Unfortunately, all that I can offer to answer that question are speculations, because there is no, to my knowledge, there is no, or I should say there was no, because this publication is no longer circulating. There is no, or there was no rigorous study of the reception and the mediation of these crime tabloids in the Los Angeles context. The way that we do have ethnographies and oral histories and anthropologies of the readers of these crime tabloids in the Mexican side of the border. So I think we can speculate as to the differences in reception and in mediation of these crime tabloids in Los Angeles on the one hand and Mexico City on the other hand. But I think these are the kinds of insights that are best supported with engagement with the actual readers, because many of the things that we do learn from the rigorous study of these communities of readers that has been done, is that many of the prejudices and many of the biases that one brings as an educated scholar and as an educated, interested reader in these crime tabloids are often proven wrong by the way these readers use and appropriate these crime tabloids.
I'm welcoming you all to submit your questions, the Q&A. In the meantime, I might ask a question if that's okay, Sergio.
Yeah, just 1 second, because I think the staff cleaning the office are hi.
Sure.
I think I have office cleaning. Hi, I think that yes. Sorry, the moving.
No problem. So, you described part of, my background is molecular biology. And so I was interested in the introduction of this idea of transduction. And, I also did microbiology. So I remember studying that really well. One part that you kind of mentioned, there's something like a magical part of this, like these bodies kind of being brought together without having to make contact, right? And this transfer of information. And even with like my work in the lab, I still considered that part, like, being part of the process of recombinant kind of technologies and using bacteria for that, I still do see it as magical that this part of this movement and connection between these two bodies. One part that I guess I wanted to hear you talk about, there was the image of the spaghetti stain and the bloodshot wound and the affect of that moment, right? That there's still a physicality involved in that, even though the bodies aren't touching. Like, we know, for example, that racism actually has physiological impacts on us, right? And epigenetics now tells us that, our social environments are having a biological impact. Can you talk a little bit more about like that scholarship that is connecting maybe like affect to like the physicality part of affect? I'm just really curious.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And luckily for us who are interested in these discussions, there's great scholarship that has been produced recently, and I think some of the most, as far as I understand it, this kind of magical mirroring of affective states between two beings who are not actually physically connected to each other, and who yet manage to not just mirror but sometimes attune their physical states, happen precisely in the presence of this physicality you underline. I have in mind a study whose author I can't remember, regarding the kind of neurological changes that can be traced when images of very gruesome violence are shown to a person. And the way that this response, this neurological response, is described by the authors of this study is such that it suggests that the pain that is sort of represented in these images can actually be felt in some kind of sense by someone who's just witnessing this image. Now, that sounds very abstract, but I think most of us have been intimately acquainted with what that feels like. The sight of great bodily injury, and certain kinds of bodily injury in particular, just the very sight of that produces such a strong bodily reaction in most of us that we tend to avert the sight of something like a broken bone piercing through skin, because it seems to start a chain of feelings and affective responses that mirror somehow the pain that person is experiencing. So that in itself, again, it's something that I've been curious in for a while, but some of my first entries into this field, it just made it seem so sort of egocentric and appropriative, the idea that you can feel someone else's pain, but then to find these studies that are finding or that are sort of tracing mechanisms, neurological mechanisms that allow for this to happen, feeling someone else's pain, feeling someone else's affect, has been greatly encouraging for the kind of work that I'm interested in doing. Now, for the purposes of this kind of intervention, this kind of artistic intervention, I think what we're faced with is the question of how powerful can an image be, or how powerfully can an image transmit affect or allow for that which I'm calling the transduction of affect. And I think there's enough body of work on the sciences part of the discussion, and increasingly on the aesthetics and the humanities part of this discussion, to at least warrant further exploration that images, in fact, are not just, not simply some kind of removed representation of what this pain feels or what the physicality of racism is like, but that they can, in fact, under certain contexts and under certain framings, not just transmit the affect, the sort of the feeling that whatever they're representing carries with them, but that they can start those same processes of transformation, those same processes of transduction that we have studied in relation to sort of direct, not direct, but presential witnessing of something like pain or something like violence or something like racism.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. I have a follow-up question, but we've had a couple more questions come in, so I'll go to those first. Isabel Altamarino asks, in this century, what has replaced these tabloids?
That's a great question. That's a great question. I've been thinking about that a lot. I think maybe it might be more productive to think about the sort of the afterlives of these tabloids, not so much as a replacement, but the sort of the continuations of the kind of lives, the kind of content that these tabloids portrayed. Now, something that there's a part of these tabloids that has to do with sort of picturing very gruesome violence, and there's also a part of these crime tabloids which I didn't discuss so much, which is the kind of news that they cover. So yes, crime tabloids are primarily or most famously known for covering very violent events, but these crime tabloids are also, when you compare them in a kind of quantitative way to a newspaper of record, something like the New York Times, these crime tabloids were also fiercely focused on local news and on the portrayal and the reporting of events that were deemed either too local or too popular to appear in national newspapers. So I think as we kind of trace what replaced these crime tabloids, or how these crime tabloids sort of managed to find some kind of continuation in other media, both in printed media and in digital platforms, it's important to sort of keep an eye out for all the things that these crime tabloids were doing. If we look for what kind of platforms are representing the kind of violence that these crime tabloids were representing or portraying, we can look at things like blogs. And in Mexico, for a period of time during the height of the so-called drug-on wars, blogs were the ones that took up the presentation of these kinds of photographs and these kinds of stories. But I think it's also important to sort of ask oneself, who took who continued to do the kind of work of presenting stories of so-called popular subjects after the demise of these print publications, because that was another important function of these crime tabloids, and that's among other things one of the reasons why they were so popular. The people who were reading, the readerships, the communities of readers who were buying these crime tabloids saw themselves reflected in these crime tabloids, however exploitative they might seem. From what we know of the oral histories of these communities of readers, the ethnographies of these community of readers, they saw themselves sort of represented, seen, so to speak, by these crime tabloids. So I think as we sort of follow up with that question, we have to be looking for both things.
Thank you. We have another question from Lynn Huffer. Lynn says, thank you for your talk. Your research is wonderful, and I look forward to hearing more about it. I'm wondering about how your comments about negative affects, especially shame and disgust, build on or depart from the uses of negative affects, especially shame, in certain strands of queer activism and queer theory to counter the conventionality of queer pride. I believe Tompkins says something about shame that seems relevant to your argument about shame and counter shame, that this negative affect is paradoxically a key affect in the maintenance of sociality. Is there a way to remain cognizant of this claim by Tompkins while also challenging the disproportionate shaming of BIPOC communities and other marginalized people?
That's a great question. I think I'll say the following. One influential thinker of the place of negative affect, the kind of function and the force that negative affect has in queer communities, and this notion of queer shame, and someone who's sort of lurking very much in the foreground of this work that I'm doing is Jose Esteban Munoz. And I think that one way to sort of, not so much to answer your question, because I think it opens up lines of inquiry that I need to consider further. But one thing that I've been trying to be mindful of is what Jose Esteban Munoz describes as the possibility of negative affect constructing what he calls communities of unbelonging. I think for him, the work that negative affect can have, or the way in which queer communities and racialized queer communities in particular have reframed negative affect as a way of constructing commonalities beyond identity, and constituted by this, which he calls senses of unbelonging, is something that I try to remain mindful of. But I thank you for that question, Lynn, and I'm gonna have to write to you because I'm curious to hear more.
I'll move on to the next question then. One of our attendees says, wonderful talk, very important issues. Could you talk more about the complex tensions between desire and disgust?
Right. Yes. So desire and disgust, that's a big question. We could be here all day talking about that question. I think one of the ways in which I've been thinking about just how powerful disgust. I'll begin with disgust in first. One of the ways in which I've been thinking about just how powerful disgust is as a kind of feeling, as a form of affect, is to think about it in the most sort of primordial, in the most sort of foundational way in which we begin to sort of enter the world. That first sort of notion of distinguishing very early on, sometime in the first few months of life, between a sense of that which is me and that which is not me. Now, the writings on disgust sort of, they point to the main function of feeling of disgust as precisely that which allows us to remain attentive to that which should belong to us, that which should form part of us, and that which should absolutely be kept as not us, as away from us, as repulsive, as something that needs to be kept at a distance. I think as a force, as a feeling that allows us to make that distinction, the distinction between that which should be close to us or even inside of us, and that which should be averted and excluded and kept at a distance. As that kind of force, you start to see just how powerful disgust is, and also just how layered its operations are, the ways in which disgust functions, not just and not only in a kind of conscious and verbalized way, but in structures that start to look and that effectively operate at the level of the unconscious, but also at sort of the larger level of the social and the sort of physical, visceral level of the body. Disgust sort of operates along all those levels. And I think in its complexity, it starts to look as important and as complex and as constitutive of all our relationships, of our very relationship to the world and to others as desire is. So in that sense, I think your question points to the potential, and it's a potential that is by no means unexplored. There's terrific, wonderful scholarship on Disgust. William Miller, I think, or William Milner wrote a whole book on the subject of disgust, and it's the one that's most cited by scholars interested in this subject. But I think the scholarship on desire is much larger, much greater, and their sort of comparable complexities for me suggest that the same kind of interest and the same kind of insights that can be sustained when we study something like desire can also be sustained when we study further in depth something like disgust.
Thank you, Sergio. We have another question that's come in from Jose Quiroga. Jose says, ASCO is an example of a particularly heroic period of Chicano art in its relationship to community. And there is a wonderful genealogy that moves from them to Guillermo Gomez Peña, etc. But what happens when we get to Andres Serrano and his Christ submerged in urine, turning into sound bites for reactionary politics, and then driving a wedge between artists and the community itself? To what extent are the politics of ASCO impractical today?
Right. Well, I think that's a great question. I think one thing one thing that I try to stay attuned to is the fact that any kind of force, any kind of impact that these images, that these work, any kind of impact that affect itself can have and disgust itself can have, is always not just historically determined and sort of socially specific. It's also mediated by the people who are reading and appropriating and interpreting any one work, any one image at any one time. I think the idea here, or the reminder, at least for me, is to resist any temptation of reading the power of these images, whether it's a progressive power, so to speak, or a reactionary power, as inherent to those images, or along the same veins, to resist the temptation of reading a kind of gesture, a gesture that, for instance, deploys disgust as part of its critical force, as a gesture that will remain stable regardless of the context of circulation and the way in which that circulation and the kind of reception and mediation that circulation will allow for will be determined, sometimes over-determined, by larger sort of historical circumstances, and also by larger social specificities. I think a great sort of example of just how unstable these kinds of gestures with negative affect can be is exemplified by these images, these anecdotes that I shared with you about how these same tabloids or some of these same stories and images can be perceived in diametrically opposed ways by two communities, depending on their social and economic standing, and depending too on their levels of education. I think it's true the kind of the genealogy you draw from sort of from ASCO forward to Guillermo Gomez Peña, to more recent deployments of these kinds of negative affects and disgust. There's truth to that, but what I wouldn't do, or what I would sort of think hard about, is whether that genealogy suggests any kind of stable movement of how disgust can be deployed from one moment to another. I think even the works of ASCO can sort of they can and they are beginning to sort of vary and perhaps move away from that, what you rightly point out as that sort of heroic aura of their works, towards something that looks much different, much more approachable and much more immediate. Now that the kind of performance-based sort of public space social exhibition,ism that they use to produce their work is once again starting to seem as something that we see on the street, that's something more approachable, so to speak, and also more effective. That's a great question. Thank you.
We have another question from Edgar. How conscious are people and communities in transduction? What extent do they mediate the experience? What is the difference between feeling the atmosphere and reading the room?
Those are really good questions. I think the sort of my gut or sort of an initial sort of approach to that question is that while I hesitate to construct a sort of conscious unconscious binary to describe how something like the transduction of affect takes place, if we were to draw a spectrum with sort of two polar opposites, on the one hand sort of conscious processes and interventions, and on the other hand unconscious operations, processes, interventions, however we want to describe them. If we were to draw that kind of spectrum, something like the transduction of affect would need to be placed closer to the sort of unconscious, sort of unreasonable, so to speak, side of that spectrum. I think the way that I understand the transmission of affect, the way that someone like Teresa Brennan thinks about the transmission of affect, is something that happens, so to speak, despite oneself, despite yourself, notwithstanding any kind of defenses we might construct around things like affect. The transmission of affect does happen and will happen in ways that are beyond our control. And the sort of the examples she presents are things like the kind of function and effect that pheromones have, the kind of function and effect that certain smells can have. And those are the same examples that someone like William Milner will then use to talk about how disgust works and how disgust sort of travels and affects people despite any kind of defense that they might sort of present against the transmission of that disgust. Now, reading the room, on the other hand, and I'm going to have to follow up with you to credit you for this comparison, because it's a really great comparison. Reading the room to me sounds like much closer to the kind of conscious side of that spectrum. I think reading the room, the way I understand the expression, and if I misunderstand it, it wouldn't be the first time I wouldn't say misinterpreting, but reinterpreting an idiomatic expression in English. The way I understand that expression is that reading a room entails, yes, a little bit of a sort of intuition on one's part, but also kind of a conscious, deliberate effort to draw some kind of cartography based on what we can feel about the room, but also based on the kind of classifications, separations, the kind of nominations that we can make when we walk into a room. So I think no strict separation, but I would put transmission of affect closer to the unconscious side, reading a room closer to the conscious side.
That is a great question. We've had several great questions. We have a couple of minutes left. I guess I always like to hear that, our faculty, in the amazing scholarship that they're doing, they're also, a lot of this is happening in the classroom space. And I noted that you thanked your graduate students, Sergio. I'm a little curious to know, how working with your students has added to this scholarship for you, and particularly, with, I guess, social media and the images that are, it's a different kind of era and time and access to this kind of imagery. How do students, what are the questions that they bring to you, and, ideas that you generate together?
Yeah, that's a great question. So these matters are very much present, because in fact we had a meeting of the graduate seminar where I'm teaching these materials today. So we just met today and we just had that discussion. And I think there's a few things that happen in the seminar room, which sort of make their way, so to speak, which have a direct and sometimes sometimes sort of immediate or sometimes delayed impact on the kind of writing that I'm doing. I think one thing that happens, and I'm always sort of I'm always joyful to notice this, is it's not even confirmation, it's this kind of mirroring. I think one thing that happens in the seminar room is to sort of gauge the extent to which things, they can be ideas, materials, images, references, things that seem sort of exciting or intriguing, somehow energizing, are also energizing, not just for me who chose those materials, but for the students who have assigned these readings, these references to. I think over the years, to me, that has been an important sort of gauge in terms of the kind of power that a certain material, a certain idea, or even a certain concept has. I think it's happened before that a kind of an example, an image, an artwork, or a formulation, a language that I'm using that may seem very exciting or very intriguing to me, when I explore it out loud with a group of students with whom I've hopefully built some kind of rapport and some sort of trust, I can sort of test out whether that energy, that excitement holds. And that's how I arrive at the current name of the book project. I had tried out different sort of book titles with my students. And I think I'd gone through like 4 or 5 where people were just sort of nicely reacting to it, but not just to the title, to the sort of to the conceptualization behind the title. And the moment that I tried out the one I'm working with right now, A Nervous Archive, it was the first time where I noticed an immediate sort of positive reaction from the students. It's like, yes, that's what sensationalism is, There's no logic to it, which I was considering for a previous title, but there is a certain a sense of nervousness behind this archive. So that, I think, that has been important, tremendously important in the classroom. Another thing that has been important, and this has been true for both undergraduate teaching and graduate teaching, I feel a great sense of responsibility in my sort of classroom engagements to remove obstacles that are in front of a student's learning to the extent of my ability. And some of those obstacles have to do with the kind of language we often use as scholars to talk about the things we're talking about. So often in the readings we're doing, there's tremendous and tremendously exciting ideas in front of us, but often those ideas are somehow partly out of view because of the language that is being used to present those ideas. So with students, and this is something that I try to rehearse in my meetings with students, I try to stay with the complexity and the substance of these ideas in a way that removes some of this discursive obstacles in front of these ideas. Another way of putting that is that with my students, I challenge myself and I challenge my students to restate or paraphrase some of these ideas in ways that are not simpler, but in ways that are more concise and that allow for a conversation between groups of people who haven't been able to spend as much time with these materials as I have.
Well, that is great. I want to thank you, Sergio, and I want to thank all of the participants who came to this first Fridays. I will say that, it is very hard to read the room in a Zoom room. It's harder even in a webinar, but I will say that I have felt the energy. Thank you for an amazing presentation, and thank you for the energy of the questions. And I hope to see you all next month for the first Fridays. Bye, everyone.